shall bring you further news as quickly as...
Welcome to the next stop on our historical journey. Over the course of 10 months, we have traveled through the ages of human civilization from prehistory to through early civilization of ancient East, ancient Greece, Rome, then Renaissance Italy, and all the way to the 20th century. On our journey, we witnessed how civilization changed technology and how technology also impacted societies, civilization, and ultimately diplomacy. Today, our stop is in the 21st century, and we will talk about the internet and the impact it had on diplomacy. And as you can imagine, this impact is a big one. My God, this is the end of diplomacy. This was a reported reaction of the Lord Palmerston, British Prime Minister, and Foreign Secretary and very seasoned diplomats when he received the first telegraph message in 1850s, I think from Paris, when the negotiations were going on after Crimean War. More recently, in the 90s, the US diplomat Zbigniew Brzezinski made the same prediction after starting using the internet. There was a question of future and survival of diplomacy and the really great impact of technology. As we know, diplomacy survived in the past telegraph, radio, television, and many succeeding communication technologies. Although most of these innovations, technological innovations, influenced diplomacy, they did not challenge the very nature of diplomatic functions and purposes. Technology helped diplomats to perform their routine and traditional tasks by using the latest tool without altering the core of diplomacy. In most cases throughout the history, new technologies reinforce the importance of diplomacy and define its more important role in society. And you will see, I will be arguing that internet will do the same. Nowadays, the diplomats use the internet, World Wide Web, email for gathering and sharing information, negotiating, communicating, and performing other diplomatic functions. Even the corridor diplomacy that was for a long time strongly linked to traditional face-to-face discussions, even corridor diplomacy started being influenced by messaging, Twitter, WhatsApp, and other tools. The internet has opened up two-way channel of communication, providing a tool that allows individuals and organizations worldwide to influence global policy. It extended diplomacy beyond traditional circles of diplomats. All in all, the history of technology and diplomacy and internet in diplomacy as the latest phase is the story of continuity of core function of diplomacy and changes in the way how diplomacy is performed. Let us reflect quickly on the invention of the internet. The internet started as a government-supported project. In the late 60s, the US government sponsored the development of Defense Advanced Research Project Administration Network, so-called DARPANET, a resilient communication resource designed to survive a nuclear attack. It was a network of computers that would enable government leaders to communicate to one another, even in the case, as we mentioned, nuclear attack on the telephone and telegraph system at that time. In the mid-70s, Windsurf, Bob Kahn, and Louis Pouzin, in one different thread, laid the basis for the so-called TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, based on packet switching network, sending the packets over the internet. It was a way for all of the computers to communicate with one another, even in the case if there is disruption of the parts of the network. Fast forward, and the internet continued developed, and in the early 90s, Tim Berners-Lee, British computer programmer at CERN here in Geneva, introduced the World Wide Web, a web of information that anyone on the internet could retrieve. Tim Berners-Lee created more or less the internet that we know today, with web pages, with exchanges and URL addresses. Now, this is the setting. Let's now focus on digital diplomacy, e-diplomacy, cyber diplomacy. You can use different acronyms, and we'll reflect on use of the prefixes as well. It can be defined as the use of internet and new information communication technologies to help achieve diplomatic objectives and perform diplomatic functions. If we define it, definition should focus on interplay between internet and diplomacy, ranging, and in three areas, ranging of impact on the internet on geopolitical and geoeconomic environment for diplomacy in which it is practiced, impact on the internet of emergence of new topics on diplomatic agenda that diplomats negotiate, such as cybersecurity, privacy, AI governance. And third, impact of the internet on the use of internet tools to practice diplomacy, social media, email, website. Let's just reflect on each of them. New environment for diplomatic activities is a changing landscape of economic and political power, and impact on, let's say, protection of sovereignty. Diplomats are, by definition, protectors and promoters of the concept of national sovereignty. Future generation of diplomats will have to work in fundamentally different geopolitical and geoeconomic environments. Diplomats have, for example, to move their diplomatic representation from traditional economic centers. In the past, let's say in the United States, it was Detroit as a car industry hub in the 50s. Now, the new centers in the United States, the new center is the Bay Area. And we can find these new dynamism centers all over the world. Shenzhen in China, Bangalore in India. Diplomats started reflecting on it, and the new models of diplomatic representation started appearing, for example, in the Bay Area, with the tech ambassadors and tech envoys. All in all, digital technology, transfer of data, AI, is increasingly shaping the evolution of political and economic environment for diplomatic activities, including different share of powers. Therefore, this is the first impact, new environment, geopolitical, geoeconomics. The second one is emergence of new topics on diplomatic agenda. These include cybersecurity, data protection, management of internet infrastructure, AI governance. In addition to new digitally driven topics like artificial intelligence governance, all the topics, traditional topics, are increasingly influenced by digitalization. Commerce is becoming e-commerce, health is increasingly becoming digital health, and so on. On the agenda of the United Nations, specialized international organizations, and regional actors, there are more and more digital issues. In order to reflect this emergence of new topics, countries started developing digital foreign policy. Switzerland introduced new digital policy, Netherlands, Australia, and other countries. The UN international organizations are also adjusting. And many others will have to follow this major shift in the coming years, including civil society, tech companies, academia, and media. Therefore, this was the second impact of the internet on diplomacy, new topics. The third one is emergence of internet and digital tools for diplomacy. While conventional forms of diplomacy are still dominant, an increasing number of diplomats use internet as a new tool for communication, gathering information, and public diplomacy. Over the course of last, let's say, 20 years, the tools used in diplomacy changed rapidly from introduction of email to first use of the website in 1990s by diplomatic services, to arrival of computers in conference room, and most recently, the intensive use of social media such as blog, Facebook, and Twitter. The introduction of each new e-tool altered the way things were done traditionally and opened new opportunities for diplomats and diplomacy. These new tools should help diplomats to perform better their function, and we can get back to the old traditional outline of this function in the Article 3 of the Vienna Convention to represent their countries. They have new tools, including metaverse, which is emerging now, to negotiate. A lot of new tools for negotiations are introduced, including big data, AI, to gather information. That's obvious, obviously the internet is changing, and to protect the interests of their citizens and companies. Regarding the tools, the academic work and debates were heavily steered toward public diplomacy and social media. It became especially fashionable after the Arab Spring, when we had Facebook and Twitter and other diplomacy. That it bit distorted overall discussion on digital diplomacy. Fortunately, in recent years, more focus is put on using digital tools for core diplomatic function, as outlined in Vienna Convention. The COVID-19 pandemic has increased the seriousness of discussion, in particular with regard to the emergence of online meetings and in multilateral diplomacy. This is more landscape how this third impact of new tools is discussed and considered. Let's just dive deeper on the use of social media in diplomacy. Art of communication lies at the core of diplomacy. The eloquence, the fluency, the use of ambiguity is a trademark of a good diplomat and diplomacy. With the expansion of social media, especially Facebook and Twitter, the diplomats had to adapt and use social media as an additional communication channel. In addition for being a channel for communication, social media proven to be a very useful source of information for diplomatic reporting, particularly in environments where diplomats and media access is limited in crisis situation and conflicts. In diplomatic practice, everyday diplomatic practice, social media can be an important tool, also for communicating the position of the negotiating practice. We follow the dynamics around the Brexit negotiation, where social media was used for signaling by frequent tweets of a chief negotiator and other actors. That example is waiting for one, at least master, if not doctoral thesis. In addition, social media enables rapid changes in public opinion. Therefore, diplomats must recognize the signals when they started emerging at very early stage, especially signals that can affect position and prestige of countries they represent. According to the latest number, Twitter has almost between 400 and 500 million users. As the audience rushed to their tweets feed for the latest news and statements, diplomats have to be prepared. What was once a marginal activity of diplomats had to become, to some extent, one of central practices in their profession. According to Twiplomacy, the leading study and the space for following the use of Twitter as a digital tool by governments, international organizations. For example, in 2018, over 97 of all 193 UN members said had an official account or presence on Twitter. The most popular platform globally for world leaders are Twitter, followed by Facebook, and then Instagram, I'm sorry. Until the US election in 2020, former US President Donald Trump personal account at Real Donald Trump was the most followed with more than 80 million followers. After him, the next one, and still leader, is Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Pope Francis. Pope has over 50 million followers across the 9 Pontifex accounts in multiple languages. Therefore, it's quite a powerful tool for the outreach. United Nations also uses social media platform and other digital tools to enhance the outreach of its message and the work that they are doing. Especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Organization dramatically increased its following to 21 million followers on all social media platforms, almost catching up one of the UNICEF, UN Children Fund, which has been for quite some time the leader in terms of following in the UN family on the internet. Therefore, we are seeing increasing use of social media as a tool for dissemination information. In 2019, Diplomacy organized a Twitter poll. They asked world leaders, governments, and foreign ministers on Twitter how they use the platform and what were benefits of Twitter for digital diplomacy. Most of the foreign ministers replied that Twitter is a tool for furthering diplomatic and foreign policy goals, for communicating diplomatic and consular activities and messages. One of the answers said that the great benefit of Twitter for diplomacy is that content travels far and fast, directly engaging and impacting people. Now, on this point is extremely interesting because one of the traditional talent and skill of diplomats was to have a control over the message. When they communicate, they should anticipate where that message will land. Problem with social media, and I would say limitation for its use in diplomacy, effective use, is that you never know when and in what context, political, economic, social, human, your message will land and potentially being recontextualized, in some cases manipulated. Let's move from social media to online conferencing and e-participation. But before we move on, let's hear from Adriana, our moderator, if there are any questions and comments in the chat. Adriana, over to you.
Thank you for the floor, Jovan. There was one question. If you have the data with you, which countries are for the champions of Twitter or social media-based diplomacy? Now, you did mention the leaders, but what about their consular or representatives or their ambassadors. If you have that data, that is something that the audience is interested in. No more questions so far, but I'm guessing that since it is recent history, we are familiar with it. So I'd give back the floor to you at this point.
Could you repeat the second one, recent history, about what?
No, I'm saying since it is recent history, I'm assuming that a lot of our participants are familiar with some of the details you are now saying. So perhaps that's why we haven't had many questions, but I assure you we are all ears. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Adriana. Well, you can share the link to Twiplomacy in the chat, which I cannot do right now. It contains really up-to-date and I would say the most comprehensive survey of what's going on, especially on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find all details about ambassadors, dev missions, and consulates following the digital. And I think this question is very important. We often focus on the leaders, Prime Minister, President, but in reality, what matters is how social media is used by diplomats on the ground to engage with local communities, to see what are the specificities. And there are a few practices. I think US and UK are very effective in using social media, very often trying to build the following around non-diplomatic issues. Something around food, local culture, sport, and that's an interesting way to engage with local public around the issues that people are interested in, and then possible to communicate also other messages which matters more for the diplomats representing his country. Let's now move from the social media for online conferencing and e-participation, and one of the tools that we use today is Zoom. And we basically started online participation long time ago in 2006. And it was really exotic when we were explaining to people what we were doing. But nowadays it's a common practice all of us are using. And COVID-19, one collateral, let's say, we can say positive impact is that people discovered online tools, starting using them, hopefully not shifting to only online meetings, especially in diplomacy, hopefully regaining some sort of balanced, or as it is called, the hybrid approach between physical meetings and online meetings. But one of the major impact of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, which still is unfortunately going on, is increasing awareness about these tools, acquiring skills, and integrating them into the activities on many organizations, universities, and diplomacy is not exception. And what was really interesting is that diplomats adjusted relatively fast and acquired new tools, which shows that they are not as conservative profession as sometimes is painted, but there is a necessity they can do it. Let's see a bit of history. The first remote participation session in multilateral diplomacy was held by the International Telecommunication Union in 1963, I think October 1963, connecting New York and Geneva. With the emergence of the internet, as we show, diplomats started using online audio tools for online and remote participation. One of the first pioneering activities was the World Summit on Information Society, which introduced multi-stakeholder model, and also intensive use of remote participation in the context of the Internet Governance Forum. The availability and arrival of the internet and social media in conference room has made remote participation a reality and open potentials for more inclusive and transparent international negotiation. With some breakthroughs and advantages and some disadvantages which could impact diplomacy and discretion, which is sometimes important element for reaching compromise and not playing to the audience back home, where two negotiating parties, if the cameras are in the room, if social media is used, could basically communicate to public back home ahead of elections, of ahead of galvanizing public opinion. Therefore, social media can, in some cases, endanger effective diplomacy as a way for solving conflicts and reaching a compromise. Video conferencing, Zoom, and other means of digital communication have ensured continuity of diplomatic practice and negotiation in COVID crisis, but also in other contexts whenever there is a need for the ongoing processes. There are some weaknesses. The absence of informal spaces for meeting is regarded a real loss in terms of relationship building and information gathering. In addition, some protocol requirements do not translate well into online meetings and video conferencing. Diplomats represent their country, and it's not just a question of the simplified hierarchy and the importance of importance of ambassadors. They represent the country, and they need to have a proper ranking, because it's not a personal, it's a question of their function. However, this type of hierarchy signaling cannot be established as clearly during video conferencing on a standard platform as it can be done in vivo. Again, I mentioned protocol and hierarchies, not necessarily as a personal sort of preference, but part of the function of representing country. As diplomatic practice has shifted towards video conferencing, one of the key challenges include solving security issues, adapting to changes in communication negotiation, offering translation services, ensuring a stable internet connections. There are concerns about danger of exclusion due to the bandwidth requirements and security restriction. This is particularly challenging for small and developing countries. There is one recent survey which was done that online meetings during the pandemic crisis increased the overall participation in developing countries, but decreased participation of the least developed countries. That could be explained due to the problems with infrastructure and the telecommunication infrastructure. Therefore, you never know how these breakthroughs are going to impact diplomacy and diplomatic activities. In addition, UN and other international organizations face the problem of conducting meetings on the private conferencing platforms. When they meet physically, they meet at the UN headquarters in New York or here in Geneva in the public space under protection of diplomatic immunities. When we have meetings online like this one, we meet on the private platforms with all guarantees for ensure the data protection and safety. But on very symbolic level, one can think, and we at Diplo started discussing it, of creating platform which would be public good, public space developed on open source technology, which could be some type of replica of what exists in real life with the UN buildings, with the buildings of Parliament, international, and other public organizations. Online meeting, which made a huge shift during the pandemic crisis, gradually slide into hybrid or blended form of diplomacy and meetings that combines in situ participation with virtual attendance. And the hybrid meetings are posing a new type of challenges. While it has been much simpler to have physical meetings, we knew how to meet, we knew how to negotiate, we knew how to read the diplomatic signals. Also, we adjusted relatively fast to Zoom diplomacy and online meetings in the different platforms. But hybrid meetings are posing special challenge where you will have to mediate between two social, emotional, and spaces, one online and one physical. How to ensure that they have equal rights to participate, how to ensure the flow of information, how also to ensure the flow of emotions. Any communication has an important emotional layer. Therefore, it is going probably to be one of the major challenges for the United Nations diplomatic services and organizations worldwide, how to make effective hybrid meetings. We at Diplo are experimenting the different approaches, ranging from technology to managing protocol, emotions, having the in-the-room participator, a remote moderator who will bring the views from the people outside. Of course, some immersion technology like virtual reality or augmented reality may provide some new solutions, and we are definitely waiting to see what will come from the metaverse experiment by Facebook, which is follow-up to the Second Life, which was the first experiment in the virtual diplomacy back in 2007, when we established diplomatic islands. In all of our discussion, we tried to move to some other spaces. We went to Asia, Africa, Latin America. Now today we are moving to the space diplomacy, which is not just terrestrial. It is diplomacy which was initiated with the first satellite launch in the space. And diplomats started dealing with this issue like they're dealing now with the internet, how to negotiate it. And they basically initially were worried about placing nuclear weapons into orbit. And most diplomatic efforts were focused on promoting the peaceful use of outer space. And the landmark agreement, which is still the key agreement, is Outer Space Treaty, which was concluded in 1967. It stated that space should be used only for peaceful purposes, that both space and celestial bodies cannot become the sovereign territory of any nation. In this space diplomacy, also of importance is so-called Moon Agreement on 1979, which was a multilateral treaty regulating the activities on Earth's only natural satellite. But interestingly enough, this agreement was not signed by the USA at the time, Soviet Union, nowadays Russia or China. They still have some ambition when it comes to moon, which they don't want to be constrained. A recent increase in countries and private companies using low Earth orbit, we heard about Elon Musk and others, our growing dependence on satellites is increasing the need to negotiate about governance of these spaces. There are today, and it's fastly increasing, more than 3,000 satellites. It is predicted that in a decade, that number will raise to over 100,000. The space will become very busy with new problems like space debris and potential collisions. And that is an interesting aspect. The space is becoming more commercial challenge than military as it was a few decades ago. Even without new weapons race in orbit or satellite jamming or distraction, more congestion in space mean possible more misunderstandings. The Cold War international law on space is more or less out of date, and new codes of conduct are needed. Code that would oblige states, companies, and even individuals to act and behave responsible in the outer space. Other countries are getting involved in addition to additional players. Currently, it is the United States, which is shaping to the last extent space law. And Russia, China, India are now challenging this dominant role. China, as we know, is building the permanent space stations and moving in this direction. Now, in addition to discovering new spaces, we always have some beverage. You can recall it was wine, it was whiskey, tea, And now for today, it is coffee. As you know, coffee is the world's third most consumed beverage, just after water and tea. And it is the most traded commodity on stock exchanges after petroleum. We drink, according to latest statistics, I found 500 billion cups of coffee every day. I'm sure that some of you have some cup of coffee not very far from you. But let's just quickly reflect on the history of coffee. Coffee shrubs grow wild in the mountains of Ethiopia, aware of their effects on body and mind. The locals in Ethiopia first chew them. Later they brew them raw, making a drink similar to tea. It was only in the 15th century that people started to roast coffee and green beans before brewing them. The first account of cultivation coffee in this way is from Yemen, Arabia, from the 15th century. It was interesting in the spread of Sufism, Islamic mystics who drank it at a holy ceremony, as a holy ceremonial drink. Coffee drinking led to the establishment of a coffee houses, or what we know today as cafe. These days, a bit industrialized with Cafe Costa, Starbucks, and other chains. But what was interesting in that coffee house, especially in 17th and 18th century in Europe, they became a center of conversation. And it was a coffee preferred drink of the intellectuals who thought that it flares their brains without side effects of alcohol. And somehow coffee was aligned with the idea of rationality, an important element of Enlightenment era, of sharpening the human mind, bringing rationality, and, as I indicated, without side effect of alcohol or other sort of substances. Coffee houses were the places to acquire latest news, gossip, and meet with people. Especially in London, they had a very important role. Coffee beans were often given as a diplomatic gift. In 1714, after the Utrecht Peace Treaty between Netherlands and France, the mayor of Amsterdam presented a coffee plant to King Louis XIV of France. Coffee also shaped many events in world history. In the late 18th century, about half of the world's coffee came from Saint Dominica, modern day Haiti, and the poor conditions in which black slaves worked on plantation led to uprising and forming the first independent state created by slaves. Interestingly enough, after the Boston Tea Party, as we know, it happened during the American Revolution, it was very patriotic duty to drink coffee, not so-called British tea. In the early 20th century, 95% of the world's coffee was produced in Latin and mainly Latin and South America. And a lot of it was drunk in the United States, so that its price very soon became a political question. If price went up, the consumers would be unhappy. If the price went down, that would spark revolution in producing nations. That sort of dynamics led to the International Coffee Agreement. You see, there are so many agreements. In 1962, that set limits on exports and import, as well as quota for countries. And as we are concluding today's session, I invite you, I will have a sip of coffee. It's always good. It's afternoon in Geneva, and one needs to regain a bit of energy. It's very good coffee. And with that, I would like to invite Adriana to let us know what are the comments and the reflections from the room, including the question if you had your sip of coffee already or you plan to do it. Adriana.
Thank you for the floor, Jovan. I'm not going to lie. I thought for a second you were not going to give me the floor, and we just got very chatty in the, chat. We have a few questions. We have a few comments. I think that we're going to have to stay a bit longer than we planned, but up to you to decide, of course, what are you going to address. The first question that came after my first intervention was, are you aware of any digital and media literacy training programs for diplomats? I shamelessly promoted our own courses, of course, but if there is something else that you would like to mention, please do. We had a question, do European Union institutions use digital diplomacy tools for their foreign policy objectives? Another question was, how do digital diplomacy and outreach communication intersect with attempts by some states to increase control and censorship on internet-based tools? This was a question by Max, and it was commented upon by Jorn, who said that fake news on traditional channels have always been a reality as well, and that in his opinion, social media has a major role in exposing fake news from traditional sources, to which I commented that it is sometimes very apparent with older generations who consider everything that is shown on the news at 8:00 p.m. that is the truth. Another question that we have is from Atif, and it is about content policy. How do you see the decision of some big IT companies such as Twitter to delete posts by some countries' leaders or diplomats related to violence incitement? And a question by Simon on, is there any historical precedent for private companies to become indispensable for diplomacy as Zoom has become in the past 2 years? And Maria asked, what is the return on investment, if you will, for permanent missions to be present and active on Twitter? 2 more comments, and then I'm wrapping up. Jorn commented that diplomacy loses a part of its position to adapt messages to local public. The very original role of diplomats to translate messages might lose importance in a world where people interact directly and diplomats no longer drive the communication, but are left to a role as bystanders that can merely try to damage limitation. This was a direct quote by Jorn, and it is, of course, as he stated, his opinion. And Staras also commented that he does not completely agree concerning finding consensus during e-meetings. And just as I was speaking, there's another question saying, do you think that the increasing use of cyber diplomacy may diminish when COVID-19 vanishes completely from the world? Johan, I know that was a lot.
I didn't get the question before the last one.
I was about to say that. What do you need me to repeat? It was a comment by Taras, who does not completely agree concerning finding consensus during the e-meetings. Or you were speaking about the question on what is the return on investment for
about consensus. I didn't get it completely, but I love the question when somebody disagrees. This is why I'm Taras. Thank you for disagreeing. Okay, I will also as we are. Thank you, Adriana. As we are closing, I noticed that with us is Stefano Baldi, whose podcast you will listen. You will hear too soon, and maybe Stefano, you can also step in and help. Stefano was Italian diplomat who in the mid 1990s, last century, was posted in Geneva at the ITU, and we met each other, I think, 1998, and we started digital diplomacy activities and published the first internet guide for diplomacy in 2000. Stefano had an interesting reflection about hype versus reality when it comes to digital and diplomacy. Therefore, Stefan, you may later on join. Let me just going through the questions that you posed. On media literacy, Adriana already mentioned that we have a course on media literacy. Now, what I'm going just to suggest what is our specificity, while you have many courses on social media for diplomats, Twitter for diplomats, our specificity is to anchor it in we can call it diplomatic anthropology, and more to address it through the core functions of diplomacy than possibilities to tweet, to do Facebook and Instagram. Initially, it was a bit criticized because people were so excited about Twitter, but more and more we are getting support for this approach. And that's, I would say, in media literacy for diplomats, it is extremely important to start always from the function of diplomacy. Let me be very clear. Diplomacy's core function is to reach a compromise and to negotiate agreement in a peaceful way, to harness interdependence, to protect national interests of countries with non-violent means. If use of social media can torpedo that core aims of diplomacy, social media should not be used. Now, it's a binary logic. It's much more nuanced, but that's the point in our media literacy for diplomats. EU and digital diplomacy, that was the second question. EU is really moving strongly, especially with the current commission and obviously European External Action Service into digital diplomacy. There was a bit of confusion with early focus of EU on cyber diplomacy. They call it cyber diplomacy. They have manual focusing exclusively on the question of cybersecurity. And I think that in a way confused discussion, but now Europe is getting more comprehensive approach, even toning down cyber and using more digital diplomacy in comprehensive way. Digital geopolitics, new topics on diplomatic agenda, and new tools. And I think that's really healthy move and shift which is happening in Brussels. Then there is a question of outreach and censorship. Yes, that's an interplay which is as old as humanity. Censorship and outreach, use on one side for public diplomacy or propaganda. Some cynics are arguing that all public diplomacy is basically propaganda, and countries censoring access for whatever reasons. But that's an interplay that existed in the past. That was in the focus on OSCE negotiation in 1975. There was even a resolution which is preventing ships to be beyond territorial water in order to broadcast to the national territory. Therefore, it's an old issue, and we know many interplays and many examples today of that question of filtering access. The question of deleting posts. I would say this is one of the major issues, completely under sort of discussed. And this is a big issue, which is not only related to diplomacy, but diplomats are victims of that as well. You have on one side the enormous power of companies, internet companies and tech companies that run that are becoming de facto market of public space. And on the other side, very few legal means to force them to use that power according to the public interest and legal rules, including deciding when to delete somebody. We know the right to be forgotten right in the European Union. We know very controversial decisions of the US tech companies to delete, including the President of the United States from social media. And those issues are big issues which should be addressed by society. What should be circumstances when you delete somebody? What should be due process? How you can make that decision critically used? Yes, diplomats are deleted. Yes, ministers of foreign affairs, there are examples, are deleted. It's not good practice, but in that context, they are not basically different from anyone else. One can legally argue that you can use diplomatic privileges and immunities to basically contain that. Simon, private companies, like I wouldn't say that Zoom is that big monopoly because you have You have a Teams, you have a WebEx, you have a few Chinese platforms. It's not that big, but you have many examples in the history of too big to fail. East India Company basically was a monopoly in communication by controlling telegraph cables. This is one example. I'm sure we can find some other examples, but I would say that Zoom is probably not as good example as, for example, Facebook is, or to some extent Google, potentially Microsoft as being too big to fail. There is a question: what is the return on investment? I would say, and Stefano can reflect more on it, you need to be somehow present on social media. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes procedure, it has some sort of confusing message. Entry point into social media is very simple. You need 5 minutes to establish an account. You need at least 5 days to get to understand, 5 months to get the following, and probably to follow actively people, and probably 1 year to get some reasonable following. Therefore, that sort of visual and practical distortion between easy entry point and need to put resources is very tricky. And I know that we have been discussing this podcast with Stefano a lot. Adjust message to local, this is a crucial. And whoever made this comment is essential comment. It's very difficult to localize the message. And you can localize it maybe through food, through sports, through local traditions, but you basically communicate to the rest of the world. And that element of not knowing where your message is landing is very, very tricky in social media communication. There was a question of consensus. I didn't completely understand, but let me make a clarity. There are different types of meetings. I would never run politically controversial meetings online because of need of trust, engagement. Mediation should not be run online, in my view. But you have some other meetings where you have to clean emotions. There were Dayton peace talks, Vietnam peace talks in 1975, when you had to keep the sides on the distance. Or you have a technical negotiations, many negotiations which are happening. Therefore, one has to create taxonomy of different type of meetings where you can use social media to build consensus, and when you have to restrain. And we are working on the study, quite in-depth study on that point. Yolanda, it's great to see you with us. Is end of the COVID-19 going to change cyber diplomacy? Probably not as much as we think. The pendulum moved from one side to the other side, from in-situ meeting to online meetings. Pendulum will shift back to online meetings and stabilize in the center. Once technology is discovered, it will be used. And this is sort of historical wisdom. Therefore, I can see the future use of cyber diplomacy in more realistic way, not as a hype. The real problem is cyber digital, it's so prone to hype. Cyber diplomacy, ambassadors, and media coverage, especially, including academic coverage, distorts what it is about. But I would say, realistically speaking, pendulum will shift, and we will see in what context practically we can use whatever is cyber diplomacy, and ultimately the prefix will fail and we'll have just a good diplomacy. Stefano, if you're still online, maybe you can join with a few reflections. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jovan. And sorry, I came in late for one reason that you just mentioned. I mean, I had an online meeting and a negotiation, and it went on and on. That's how it is. I have really very few things to add to what you say, what you have just said. But I would like to share some of what is happening now concerning meetings or digital tools or social media that you just mentioned. And now, when I say now, it's like I said, COVID time, since it was just mentioned. COVID time for multilateral, for those who don't know it, probably most of you, I'm in Vienna now, and I am the permanent representative of Italy to the OSCE. So it's multilateral. Multilateral means you spend most of your life in meetings, negotiating, and in this case with consensus, by the way, since it was mentioned before. So this is the system. And we were forced to be online. We were forced a few months ago, and we are back now to only online again. So there is no choice in this case. There is no hype. It's just that we have to, if we want to continue our negotiation, which we really need at this time of the year. So what is the advantage of all this for the future? I mean, now we have no choice. So I'm not saying it's good or it's bad. It's the only way. Fortunately, we have it. I think in the future, what we got from this time is that now everybody, every country is able to participate online in a decent way, which means that you cannot anymore say, but this is discriminating or it's a problem for some. Everybody got equipped one way or another to be present online. And I'm talking about multilateral diplomacy. I'm not talking about bilateral. So of course, it will be much easier in the future to get to this. I don't want to open here the limitations that you have, especially in negotiations with the online meetings. There are, of course, but there are also many advantages. That's for sure. On the consensus or non-consensus, you know, I think the consensus is not related to the kind of meeting. It's related to the rules of procedure. I mean, if it is physical or if it is online, it doesn't change. So we can have a long discussion if consensus is the best way to have effective decision making, but that's another thing. It's different. And then I would conclude just on the social media and the digital tools. I think now they are just part of our toolbox. When I say our diplomatic toolbox, there is no choice. No, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was completely different. Today, you have to know this well to be able to be effective in your work. And if we talk about social media, we talk about social media. When I say digital tools, now it's taken for granted that everybody knows how to get online and participate to an online meeting. It was not so 2 years ago, I can tell you. So things are going fast. I think most important thing is that we get equipped always in time for what is coming in the future. And I think in this sense, the activity of DiploFoundation, and there is no advertisement here, has always been exemplar, you know, exemplar. It's really unique to be ready for the future. I'm the one who profited a lot of this. Thank you, Jovan.
Thank you, Stefano, for kind words. And I'm in trouble with you and all Italian friends because my coffee is getting cold. But I hope you will give me immunity from improper drinking of the coffee. But with a bit of caffeine, it will help me to stay awake in the afternoon. It won't be difficult because it was also such an inspiring session and discussion. And I would like to thank Stefano, Adriana, Mina, and all friends, Yolanda, Alex, who were Taras, who were posing comments, Max, in the session. And that journey has been very exciting. We are closing it as an annual journey, and you will be hearing more from us. Then don't have a cold coffee, have a proper coffee, and enjoy your whatever afternoon, morning, the rest of the day. Thank you. Bye for now.
We shall bring you further news as quickly as we